Back in, you can hear me?
Yeah, we're talking. We'd like to welcome you to the Donnie Glover Show, and we're talking with the one and only Victor Pate from New York State. We're having a bit of technical challenges, but Mr. Victor, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Good, good. Now, Mr. Vic, you're in New York City, right?
That is correct. I am.
Now, I've shared these facts before. America makes up 5% of the world's population, yet America has 25% of the world's inmates. Black men are starring in this movie, and black women are the fastest growing demographic. Is that the scenario?
That is the scenario. You got it perfectly right.
Now, you've been working for years to help people who have found themselves in that situation. So the first thing I want to ask you about is the language. One thing I've learned from you over the years, and we're coming to Harlem there April 8th, next Friday. One of the things that you have taught me about is the language that we use when referring to men and women who have been adversely affected by America's justice system.
That's correct.
So teach us some of the language that we are to use. And teach us, more importantly, the language we are not to use.
Surely. So thank you. Thank you all for having me on again, Brother Donnie. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on this platform with you and also commend you on all the work that you're doing to educate and raise consciousness about various issues that affect our communities disproportionately. And to speak to the language portion of it, for years and years, there has been a dehumanization that has been associated with people that are incarcerated in our prisons and jails. And I think that, once we began to put a face to people that are incarcerated, and we began to name them as people, we began to see them as human beings. Oftentimes, people who are incarcerated are not seen or thought of as human beings. So we've worked long and hard here in New York State to change this language and use what we consider as person first language. Now, let me explain to you what we mean by person first language. When we're talking about person first, we always would like to refer to people incarcerated not as inmates, not as felons, not as convicts, because this is part of the dehumanization, but rather that you call people who are incarcerated people that are under correctional supervision, people that are justice impacted, people that have been formerly incarcerated, and people who have been formerly impacted by the criminal legal system. By using these particular words and identifying people as persons, we began to identify with people as people, because no matter what their current or former situations may be with engagement in the criminal justice system, they are still people. So we try to use person first language, and we try to refrain from using those derogatory terms as inmates, convicts, and felons. And I think that part of the process of redemption and restorativeness starts with the language that we identify people with, that more goes in turn with people as persons and as human beings. So we worked hard for years and years and years and years to get people to look at people as persons. Because these very same people that are in our prisons and jails are going to one day come out, and they're going to be our next door neighbors. They're going to be our taxpayers. There may even be our co-workers. And we want them to be seen as human beings. So we think that it should start first by using the language that identifies a person as a person.
Mr. Victor Pate,
Words we don't use.
let me just jump in for a second.
Sure.
Before we go to war, say the target is Iraq. Before war is declared on television for Americans to see, something comes before the war.
Of course.
It's a certain language that defines. Since I mentioned Iraq, they're not Iraqis. They are terrorists.
Right.
Not only are they terrorists, their women and their children are terrorists. So that makes it easy for the president of the United States to declare war on them because they're no longer Iraqis. They're no longer people. They're terrorists. I was watching a woman run for governor, and I was looking at the language she was using. And I know if she's going to win, she better modify her language. Because if all cops are good and all black people are bad, then we right back to where we started.
Correct.
Because as we've seen, some cops are not only bad, some cops are the problem.
That's right.
So just because you're a cop doesn't give you a pass.
That's true.
Help me understand the impact. See, you and your team, you came up with this language, I imagine, over the past 30 years.
Correct.
But before then, what was the language? What was the impact of the language?
So the impact of language, it is almost like being hypnotized. And what I mentioned about being hypnotized is that when you use certain language to identify or associate with a person, you automatically have a precognition in your mind of what that person is and who that person is. Thereby, you remove the human component of identifying a person as a person. And then you automatically begin to treat a person as though they are not a person. And you already have in your mind who this person is, what this person is capable of doing, or what the person may have done. Automatically, you create this barrier to understanding that below those exteriors there is a human being, and you have the disconnect of dehumanization, which automatically says this person deserves to be treated this type of way. And you made a good analysis when you used the word terrorist. And we all have this precognition of what a terrorist is. So when you identify a person with certain languages, you look at this person as being exactly what that word describes. Same way you use that language to identify people with ways, characters, what they're capable of doing. When you refer to people as a convict, as an inmate, as a felon, you automatically have in your mind what kind of person this person is, and that not necessarily is the truth of the matter. So when you use these derogatory terms, like I have described previously, you disconnect and you dehumanize a person. Then automatically you feel that this person deserves a certain type of treatment, or you put them in a certain type of classification that says this person is not deserving to be looked at as a person, or this person is not deserving to be treated in a certain way. So all of these derogatory terms in which you describe people as being convicts, felons, and incarcerated or prisoners in itself, you create in a person's mind that this person is a non-person, and you treat a person as a non-person. And this is why we strongly urge and we ask people to not use those languages when you're referring to our brothers, our sisters, and our other fellow human beings who happen to be involved or even incarcerated in the criminal legal system.
Now, Mr. Pate, you've been working with the Justice Impacted for, what, 30 years?
Not that long. Maybe about 20 years, 25 years.
And so just about anything related to this wheelhouse there in the state of New York, you've worked on, and that includes going before the New York State Senate.
Correct.
Now, most recently, you had a victory, I understand.
Yes, we did. As of 2021 March, we worked on a bill that's called the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, and what it related to was people being placed in long-term solitary confinement as being inhumane and torturous. And we worked on this bill for almost 9 years, since 2012 all the way up to 2021, which is the year we actually got the bill passed in the New York State Senate and the New York State Assembly, and it was signed into the law by the then Governor Cuomo.
Mr. Pate, I just want to know who brought this to your desk. Nobody even thinks about people locked up in solitary. We out here living our lives, you know, using the remote, checking out the TV, putting on the Wi-Fi. Mr. Pate, when you mention people in solitary confinement, it was almost something from another century, Mr. Pate. How did this come across your desk?
So it really came across my desk because of my personal impactness. I was held in solitary confinement myself throughout my periods of incarceration that, you know, an cumulative total of about 2 years intermittently. And it has been discovered that, you know, and it's been said by our UN rapporteur, who at the time was Juan Mendez, that anybody that was held in any type of isolated faction past a period of 15 days, it was considered torture. And in New York State, we had people that were being held in solitary confinement for months, years, and even decades on end. And after a more intense study of the effects of people being placed in solitary confinement, it was found that it is considered torture because of the psychological damage that happens to a person, the collateral damage that's happened to a person as a result of being in solitary confinement and once they are released, as well as people who had mental health issues that were being placed in solitary confinement. And what eventually came out of this, and this has been a report by a lot of different medical organizations, that anybody that was in solitary confinement, and they usually they mark the 15-day minimum period because Nelson Mandela came up with what they call the Mandela Rule, and it related to being placed in solitary confinement. And what had found that at least 15 days past in being in solitary confinement, people began to deteriorate in a lot of different ways. So we came up with this bill in 2012 that was called the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, and HALT stand for Humane Alternatives for Long-Term Isolated Confinement. And that particular bill addressed people being in solitary, but more importantly, past 15 days. And that we said that anybody that was in solitary confinement that had been in there 15 days would have to be put in an alternative unit that was called residential rehabilitative unit, which basically meant nobody can be held in solitary past 15 days. If you got a solitary confinement sanction because of a disciplinary reason, they would have to, at the 15-day mark, move you out of a solitary confinement unit and put you in an RRU. As I mentioned, it means residential rehabilitative unit, which basically means you would no longer be held in a cell for 23 to 24 hours a day. This bill is scheduled for its full implementation March the 31st, 2022, which means this week, Thursday, it will officially be implemented throughout New York State prisons.
Mr. Pate, take me to 2022. Now, I don't live there in New York City. We're coming up there April 8th. We're going to bring you some Black Wall Street Awards so we can celebrate some people. I live here in Baltimore. And I see a new generation. They don't care nothing about scared straight. They going to prison. They going to jail. I mean, in my day, we were petrified to go to jail. No, nobody want to go to prison. I got a friend that just come home. He been locked up since I was 14 years old, 40 years. We have a generation today that doesn't seem scared of that penitentiary, man. What's going on today?
So what's going on today? When you look at our generation, as you just mentioned, Doni, not having fears of going to prisons and jails, not having fear of reprisal, not having fear of picking up guns and, resolving their issues. I think you have to look at the longer picture. The bigger picture is where we are as a society and what we are doing to deter people from going to prisons and jail. More importantly, what kind of services are in place, what resources are in place to teach and raise consciousness about the downfalls of people going to prisons and jails. And I think that is not up to our government, not up to our officials, but I think that is up to us as community members to take an active hand in placing intervention programs in place that will teach and avert our youth and not have them glorify going to prison as a badge of honor. And I think that when you look at what's needed in our community, what we need is resources. What we need are people to step up, speak up, and take an active hand in explaining the realities of prisons and jails, because you can go to jail, but that don't mean you're coming back out.
Mr. Victor, is nothing more degrading to me than to have grown men in my community having a conversation that starts off something like this. Boy, you don't know nothing about bitten. And then there's this competition about who knows more about prison. And I'm embarrassed to hear it, because I was taught that anything like that, you don't want to tell nobody. You don't want to tell nobody you've been locked up. You don't want to brag about it. You don't want to put it out there. You don't want nobody even thinking about it. Why? Because as a black man, you got enough damn marks against you already in America. But where did it become? Why do I hear grown man saying something like, you don't know nothing about bitten? I don't want to know nothing about bitten. I wasn't built for a cage.
Here's my response to that, Brother Doni. And myself as a formerly incarcerated person, right? I don't look at that, as the badge of honor for me, because it's not. But what I use this experience as is an opportunity to teach and raise consciousness about the realities of prison, about the realities of going down that road, about the realities of what can happen to you in prison, that you don't necessarily have to come back out. And, you speak about people being held in prisons for long periods of time and decades and decades and decades. And, you have brothers and sisters that are in our jails and prisons right now because they have been given long periods of incarceration. They may or may never get out to tell the story. These are our teachers. These are actually our mentors, because they are directly impacted through our criminal legal system. And when I talk to groups of young kids, youth, and especially those of our kids that are at risk, because all of our kids are really at risk, and I say to them, that you think that you can go to prison, and when you go to prison, it's going to be all good. You're going to be having fun. I give them the reality of what happens to you when you go to jail. The degradation, the treatment as though you are a slave, because our prisons are an extension of slavery. We all know that, and it's been said many times over. Prisons are an extension of slavery. And I say to them, I say, our ancestors died, sacrificed their lives and their blood in order for us to be able to do the things that we do today. In order for us to be able to do work like you and myself are doing. There are people who have sacrificed themselves. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. I think that it is a disrespect to our ancestors that we, as people of color, do not take advantage of opportunities to educate and uplift our communities, as opposed to being a black mark on our community and commit horrific crimes in our communities and to our persons. So I say to them, I say, this is not the legacy that you want to follow, nor is this the legacy that you would like to be remembered for. Because there were people that died for us to be able to do the things that we do. But going to prison is not a badge of honor. It is not something that you should be proud of. As a matter of fact, I am still, I guess you could say, feeling guilty for the things that I've done that wound me up in prison. So by me doing the work that I do, for me, this is part of the restorative and part of the redemption that I took on myself to make sure that I had the responsibility to teach and raise consciousness about the negative effects of people that engage in crime and going to prison and going to jail, as opposed to being somebody in your community that contributes to our communities.
If you're just joining us, we're talking with Mr. Victor Pate. He's up in New York State. We will be visiting Mr. Pate, as we try to do once a year in Harlem. As a matter of fact, Mr. Pate, you introduced us to the Mist there on 116th Street, a club that Walter Edwards had a little something to do with. But we'll be there next Friday, 5 p.m. at the Harlem Business Alliance. And what I asked Mr. Pate to assist me with was to recognize some people who work with returning citizens, those who have been justice impacted. And Mr. Pate, you gave me a wonderful list of honorees. Can we tell them about some of the honorees for the Black Wall Street event next week?
Sure. Thank you so much, Donnie, and thank you once again for the work, and just thank you for the recognition of those that have been contributing to our communities in a positive way, who have been just as impacted or either has worked on issues that affect our community as a whole. Everybody that I have pointed out or nominated to you, my brother, are people that I have worked with in the criminal justice reform arena and or have worked with on community issues that affect our community. So one of my sisters, her name is Evelisa Gillespie. She's a Latina, somebody that I have known for maybe about 10 years or so, and she is also a formerly justice impacted person. She did a lot of time. She had a violent crime. She came home, she got connected, and she is now one of the leading advocates and activists in the criminal justice reform arena. She is one of my
Mr. Vic, you just can't skate by something like that. You said she did some time, and then come on, Mr. Vic, come on, you got to give her more than that. It takes a lot. I mean, I would imagine it's so much easier to try to block out the past.
Right.
I would imagine it's so much easier to never even, mention the word incarceration or anything having to do with it, let alone being an advocate.
Right. So
that's noteworthy, to say the least.
Yeah. So my colleague Eva Lee, she, like I say, she's engaged and involved with me. We now working on voting rights for people that are incarcerated, and she's part of our New York for Full Voting Rights Coalition, which will restore the right to vote of people that are incarcerated in our prisons and jails. And she has done some phenomenal work in this arena, and she continues to do some phenomenal work in this arena. And I'm just, happy to be affiliated and to know her and the work that she's doing. Actually, she's on her way right now today to Albany to speak with some legislators on another platform that we're working on with regards to people having their past criminal histories expunged in New York State. Another one of my colleagues is, her name is Dorian Best. Now Dorian Best she did some time in the federal system. She is my colleague and one of my committee members at the National Action Network. The committee that I head up is called the Second Chance Committee, of which I'm the chairperson of. I am a co-founder since 2009. And we actually work on assisting the formerly incarcerated men and women when they return back to the community.
Wait a minute. This means you be hanging out with Al Sharpton.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, we're going to give you your props. We appreciate the advocacy, not just in Harlem. We've seen the Reverend Al all over this country making noise when nobody else will make noise. So for him to, how did he come across you, Mr. Victor Pate? How did Al Sharpton meet the legendary Victor Pate? Not how Victor Pate met Al. How did he meet you?
So the history of me and Reverend Al Sharpton, and it's just so funny. I was living in Harlem at the time, and their headquarters is in Harlem on 145th Street. I've seen Reverend Sharpton. I've heard him a lot of times, but I've never been in the same room with him. 2009, I was walking by their headquarters where they were having their regular Saturday morning meetings, right? And I happened to be standing outside, and I heard him talk. And I walked inside. And when I walked inside, they welcomed me to ask me, have a seat. And I listened to him. And he talked, he usually addresses social justice issues, criminal justice issues, and any issue that affects our community as a whole. And they asked for people to join the organization. And I went up and I joined, right? $25 annual. I paid that, right? And I heard them say that we have a host of committees here at the National Action Network that addresses various issues in our community. One of the things that I didn't hear them say was a committee that assisted or addressed formerly incarcerated people when they return back to our communities. And he asked from the group that was at that time of orientation, is there anybody here that feels that there's a group that we don't have here that you should have, that you would be interested in starting? I raised my hand. And they introduced me to their coordinator, and they said, well, you need to talk to her, and she will tell you what to do next. At the time I spoke to her, she asked me, can I write up what my idea was and what I seen as a committee. Hence, the Second Chance Committee. It was officially installed in 2010, vetted as a committee by Reverend Al Sharpton. And ever since then, I've been at the National Action Network doing work around criminal justice legislative issues, as well as assisting formerly incarcerated people returning back to our communities and assisting the families of those people that may be incarcerated with various issues that they oftentimes have to endure, but they also need help to help their loved ones that are incarcerated. And ever since then, I've been with them.
I got to share this with you. This is something that blew my mind last week. So, a man who did a lot of time in prison in our community came home, and I got the word that he went to the family. He's been waiting decades to apologize in person. And decades later, he went to the family and gave his apology. But more importantly, number one, they were willing to listen.
That's restorativeness.
Why is that so important? Why is this concept new to me? Why isn't that talked about? Why is this so taboo? Help me out, Mr. Victor. When they told me my man went to the family, and now it dawned on me last night, for 40 years, or whenever he took responsibility, it took him from then to now to get the opportunity. And then the family, they didn't have to hear him, listen to him, receive him, but they did. Help me understand what just happened there, Mr. Victor.
So part of the accepting responsibility for the harms and the hurt that you caused is part of the healing process, especially when it involves, serious harm or loss of life to somebody, family member of somebody. Part of the restorativeness and redemption is, first of all, accepting responsibility of those that you hurt. The second part of that is to be able to say to people and ask for their forgiveness and asking for understanding, because at the time that we oftentimes make decisions, to do certain things in our life, we are at a certain place and space in our lives that may not be positive. And I think that when you talk about being able to say this to the harm, to the cause, and to the people of those that you call the harm, you have to be able to be ready for restorativeness and redemption. And the families of those who have been hurt or who have been harmed, they also have to be in a space, in a place where they are ready and open to be forgiving. Because who are we not to forgive another human being? So I think that
you say that, Mr. Victor, but I done seen television, I done seen news stories, real, fiction, non-fiction, and there's this notion, I'm not going to forgive them. They killed my loved one. Let them burn, baby, burn. Give them more time. I can't believe they got out and did only that little bit of time. Vengeance, hatred, and also retribution. Not everybody wants to hear forgiveness.
So when you look at or even you think about punishment, okay, there needs to be, and I don't really use the word punishment, I use accountability. We use the word accountability as opposed to punishment in our arena. Definitely there needs to be, and it has to be, a system of accountability for harms or wrongful actions. But we don't think that system of accountability should be forever punishment, because you have to look at, people do change. People are not the same people. When you talk about that, and when you mentioned this guy who's been away for 40 years, one of my colleagues, he was away for 40 years. As a matter of fact, he was held in solitary confinement for 40 years, right?
What?
Yeah, he was in solitary confinement for 40 years. You may have heard of his name. His name is Albert Woodfox. He was part of the Angola 3 that was held in solitary confinement for 40 years.
Hold up. Wouldn't he be dead? Like no sunlight? Wouldn't he be dead?
He survived.
Good God Almighty.
And he's out on the speaking circuit now. And I had an opportunity to meet him up close and personal. I was on a panel discussion with him one time. But, more importantly, Albert Woodfox, he survived 40 years in solitary confinement alone, okay? So when you look at the amount of punishment or accountability, or whatever word you want to term it as, punishment or accountability, that you can't perpetually punish a person for one wrong mistake they may have done in their life. I think that we as human beings, we as society should be forgiving. And I guess I can say this here, because for me, I think I did my penance, so to speak, and I accept my responsibility, and I I know that the things that I did was not right, but also at the time that I did it, I was not right. So there was a transformative period that had to happen for me. So I think when you're talking about transformation and redemption, I think that we as human beings, we have to be transformative. We have to be forgiving, because you cannot hold a person forever accountable for one bad mistake they may have done, or just say, for instance, something may have happened to somebody in your family. I think that there has to be a part in our lives as human beings that we have to be willing to move forward and not keep people in the same space and place that they might have been in at that particular time. There has to be redemption, there has to be forgiveness, and there has to be given second chances. I don't think that there's anybody on this planet that never have done anything wrong in their life. I don't think that they would want that to be held against them for the rest of their lives. So in saying that, I think that we as human beings need to be forgiving. We need to be able to give people a second chance, because that person that may have done whatever they done at that particular time, after a period of time, people begin to transform their lives, and they are no longer that person they may have been 20 or 30 years
Well,
ago.
that leads me to this question. Not only do people change, Mr. Vic, but countries change.
For sure.
Now, growing up, you couldn't have a bag of weed, couldn't get caught with marijuana. A lot of people, a lot of black people across the country are in prison over a bag of weed. America has changed now, though. If you get a license, you can buy weed. Now, they made it so expensive that even though a lot of black people buy weed, only 1 or 2 of y'all are going to be able to sell the weed. Where does this fit into your transformative justice paradigm, Mr. Victor Pate?
Okay, so and that's good. I'm glad you brought that up, because, of course, marijuana laws have changed in New York State, and you find the analysis is that those of them that have been most harmed by convictions of these laws are now the least likely people to actually, as you mentioned, to be able to own these marijuana selling, distributing factories, etc., etc., etc. And where it actually fits in to the larger grand scheme of things, right? Even though, like you say, Donnie, most of us, or most of our people who have been most harmed by these marijuana convictions are going to be the ones that are going to be least likely. However, that is now beginning to change, okay? As you say, the country is changing, right? Our laws are changing, and currently they're working on procedures that will allow those of them that were most harmed by these convictions to be able to now become licensed owners, distributors, and sellers. Now, the only part that I see that may be the real difficult part is where the funding is going to come from. That's going to be able to assist, because we don't have the financial wherewithal to become distributors and owners. I think that what needs to happen at this particular point is that when you look at the statistics and the numbers with regards to those of them that have been most harmed, then these are the ones that should be having access to the capital that will allow them to be owners and distributors and be able to benefit from the negative part that happened to them as a result of being convicted of these marijuana laws. But I think that it's so much that actually has to be done, because when the laws are changed, it's not the abracadabra stick that's going to fix everything. It's going to take a period of time for this to see any real effects, especially those who have been affected by these laws adversely for so many years, for so long. So I think that probably what needs to happen at this particular time is that there needs to be funding set aside specifically for those of them that have been most harmed by these laws, especially if they want to become licensed, because like you say, Donnie, it's an exorbitant amount of money, but our people don't have the money. If they did, then they could become become licensed. They can become sellers and distributors. So what I think that needs to happen is that there needs to be funding set aside that can make this a real transformative process, and those of them that have been most harmed can actually have a real opportunity to benefit.
Mr. Victor, we got about 12 minutes left, and I'm trying to get these questions in. Now, some time ago, the 80s, the 90s, Freeway Rick, Iran Contra Crack, Colonel Oliver North, Ronald Wilson Reagan, 666. The crack epidemic hit the black community like a ton of bricks. And you look at some of these neighborhoods today in Harlem, Brooklyn, East Baltimore, West Baltimore, crack has gone through there like a hurricane, like a tornado, ripping up everything. And back then they called the crack addicts crackheads. I remember New Jack City, and Chris Rock played the role of Pookie.
Right.
and that stereotype has almost been caricaturized. There's almost this, you think of the crackhead, you think of Pookie in the crack shop. But now, Mr. Victor Pate, here in Baltimore, there in New York City, in Harlem, in Manhattan, there are people from the majority society. They do not look like those of us in this 99.9% black community. There are non-majority members who are living in vacants. They are sleeping in dumpsters. They are breaking into old churches. They are buying dope, heroin. They are wreaking havoc all across the black community. But if it were black people doing this in their community, they would be locked up faster than a Baltimore speed camera. What's the difference? What's the difference today, Mr. Victor Pate? Because when it's not our people, when it's other people, there's a certain empathy. There's a certain level of understanding. There's this certain level of, hey, wait a minute, we have to understand their situation a little bit. But when it was us, we was dope fiends and crackheads, Mr. Victor Pate.
I agree. So let me help contextualize some of this here. And I concur with you wholeheartedly, Brother Doni. So, and here's another component of this here, right? They now look at drug use, right, as a public health crime. But when it was us, for the majority of our people that was engaged and involved in the use or distribution of any type of substances, right, it was criminal. Now they're looking at this as it's a public health crime, and now, because it has finally reached and touched their neighborhoods and reached into the vestiges of their homes, right, it now has become a public health issue, and they are now looking to decriminalize, drugs, drug usage, right, and when you look at, what has happened throughout the years, and especially in New York City with the Rockefeller drug laws, which is one of the coalitions that I worked on, and we were finally successful in getting that reform, which basically was, I guess you could say, a devastation to our community, because people that were drug users were being locked up and be given life sentences, because the Rockefeller drug laws were basically supposed to target the traffickers, distributors, and all the big woolies in the drug game. And what happened is that our communities, the brother, the sister on the corner, the crack user, the dope user, were being caught with small amount of drugs, and they were given life sentences, long terms in prisons and jails. So now, fast forward 2022, 2021, 2020, they started terming that as a public health crime. Why? Because it started affecting those other communities that weren't the communities of color. So now, we have a change in the narrative. We have a change in the mindset of society because at that time, as you indicated in the 80s, they devastated our communities. I mean, it was horrific, and that's something that we can never ever forget, which to me was part of the genocidal plan that they have always had. I think that now, because it is affecting their communities and it is devastating their families, that those of them that are in power, the elite few, are now turning and seeing this as not a criminal act, but a health safety act. And our communities and communities and people of color are now and still, because of the lack of access to substance abuse programs, community-based organizations have to take on that role as healing and helpers in our community.
So, ho. Wait a minute. Now, this 2020, I got to go to my community and I have to now help these non-black members of my community now.
So
that's what you're saying. I gotta help them.
And here's what I'm saying, Donnie. I think that it's no longer just us. I think it's a we. And see, this is part of the great trick that we have fell under for years and still being played out in so many different corners of our world. Divide and conquer. That has always worked. Divide and conquer. I think that when we get out of the, just us and look at it as a we, because it's a not just us, it's a societal problem. And I'm gonna say that it's a societal problem because when you look at in prisons and jails, it's not just the people that are incarcerated, but guess what? Our communities and our families are incarcerated.
Mr. Victor, I'm glad you mentioned that. Young black boy, 2 blocks from here, selling dope. White addict comes up to him, scoop his stuff. The young black boy says to other people standing around, respect him. He's my client. He's my customer. The young black boy is protecting the white addict. Blew my mind. This young black boy willing to fall on the sword for his white addict customer. I have never in the history of blackness seen that before.
Well, you know what? And here's where we have to look at this here, because I think that there's a level of culpability that we as a community have to take on. How is he allowed to operate in our communities untouched? Let me say this to you, right? Because I know you and I both come from the old school. There were certain things that we just did not do in our communities and we just did not tolerate in our community. Even though we were living on the dark side, there was a guideline and there was codes to the street in which we operated. Of course, this generation doesn't operate on the codes that we operated on at that particular, but there was a level of respect. And the community, you just couldn't do certain things in the community. That's why I have to take it back to we as a community have to take a stand on what goes down in our communities and not just sit back complacently and allow these riffraff thugs take over our communities. We have to stand together as a community and not allow these riffraff, handkerchief head, hat backwards, pants dragging little thugs do what they want to do in our community. We should be moving them out of our communities and sending a message that you cannot do that in this community. And until we take a stand and take a hand in our community, what you just described will continue to happen in our community. How's he able to operate in our community? And we all know what he's doing.
He's Going back to the earlier part of the conversation, that's the terrorist.
That's right.
That is the terrorist. My son, your son, our sons are now the real terrorists.
That's right.
Mr. Victor, how can people get in touch with you to support your efforts there in New York State? Again, we're going to be linking up with Mr. Victor Pate on April the 8th. That's next Friday in Harlem. And let me just say publicly, Mr. Victor Pate, we've been doing the Black Wall Street there for over a decade, and you've been a big supporter. And I gotta ask you about the young man we honored who built a library on Rikers Island.
So, and here's, and unfortunately, they don't have use to that right now because of COVID. Unfortunately, all of the programs on Rikers Island is shut down. So, you look at, and that's going to speak to transformativeness. That's what I take when you're talking about transformation. That's the epitome of transformation because he left a legacy for people to, when he's no longer here, to continue on and to be able to do the things that need to be done as far as education and raising the consciousness of our people, you know what I'm saying, and our communities, right? That just goes to show you that people do change. People are not the same people that they often go in as, and over a period of time, there's a process of transformation, which is why I say there should be restorativeness, redemption, and opportunities for second chance. And that should be, you know what I'm saying, be given anybody an opportunity to change their life, because I'm not the same person I was 25, 30 years ago when I was going in and out of these correctional systems, and the work that I do now is for the benefit of people that are incarcerated and people that are formerly incarcerated, but also how it affects our community. So for me, you know what I'm saying, to be able to do this kind of work is part of me still restoring, re-entry, and second chances, because I know I have a lot to answer for on a lot of different platforms, but I think this is why we have to start changing the minds.
Me too. I don't know if there's enough time for me, so I'm just going to keep giving back while I have time. Now, is it okay to put your phone number out there?
Surely. Everybody get my number. As a matter of fact, I'll repeat it right now. So the number is 646-229-9869.
Mr. Vic, we're so proud of you. I got to put a plug in too for Odessa Hopkins.
Yes, without a doubt. That's our people. She connected us.
Yes, she did.
And she made it happen, and ever since then we've been connected.
I remember the one we did in Harlem where her brother came home, and that blew my mind. This cat was gone 35 years, but what was most beautiful?
41 years.
41. His woman was right there beside him.
That's right.
Woo!
Actually, we all grew up together. Him, his wife, and myself. We all grew up together.
Mr. Victor, people ain't waiting 41 minutes. This sister waited 41 years.
That's something, I don't know how. I don't know what to say about that. I just say, all I can say is God was with her every step of the way.
That's a ride or die. I need me a ride or die.
God was with her every step of the way. You know what I'm saying? And that just goes to show you, you know what I'm saying, that's what it takes sometimes. And she was willing to stand by the brother and stay with him and support him and help him get through that 41 years. Now, that's a ride or die. That's the epitome of a ride or die.
Mr. Victor Pate, thank you for taking time on this beautiful Monday morning. Thank God for your work. We will be there next Friday, and we look forward to seeing you and meeting Evilise and the other honorees. But thank you for being my compadre, my friend. Thank you for sharing this information with the world. Any final thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, my final thought resources, and I forgot to mention it. I hope that you will be here. The National Action Network is having its annual convention on April the 6th through April the 9th. It is free. You can go on www.nationalactionnetwork.net. You can register. It is free. I am hosting a criminal justice panel at the network on April the 9th from 1:15 to 2:30 p.m. And it's going to be one panel that you do not want to miss. So I'm hoping that you, Donnie, and your partner, if you're going to be here for that long, that you come through. But it's going to be dynamic. We have a host of other people, but the convention is April the 6th to the 9th. Go on www.nationalactionnetwork.net. You can look at the host, you can look at the panels and everything that we're going to be doing. But I'll be having a panel on April the 9th. So thank you for this platform, Donnie, and all the work that you continue to do.
Yes, sir. We'll see you next Friday. God bless you, Mr. Pate.
Bless me too. Have a blessed one.
Yes, sir. What a wonderful time. Mr. Victor Pate, he's an icon, folks. To say the least, he's an icon. He's been doing the work for quite some time. Get ready for Mr. William Honolulu. He's coming up at 10 a.m. Also, Troy Rollins live from Los Angeles coming up at 12 noon. Frontline News with Yolanda Pulley at 6 p.m. Shared Space at 7 p.m. And the Robert Report from Montgomery County, Maryland, with Robert Washington from Mississippi. I said he from Mississippi. He comes on at 8 o'clock. My name's Donnie Glover. Have a powerful day. Good morning, world.